I wasn't a particularly religious person, but my grandmother's passing brought me back to St. Augustine's, a place I hadn't visited in years. The old structure had a certain weight to it, not just in its towering presence, but in the way it held memories, some warm, others less so. My family had long ties to the congregation, and though I had distanced myself, I was expected to assist with the funeral arrangements. The service took place on a Sunday afternoon. I arrived early, mostly to avoid the inevitable family interactions. The church was exactly as I remembered: cold stone floors, the scent of old wood and candle wax, and sunlight filtering through stained glass windows. The priest, Father Elias, greeted me with a handshake and an expression that seemed overly knowing. He mentioned he was glad to see me and hoped I'd consider reconnecting. I nodded out of politeness and turned my attention to the preparations. The ceremony was standard: prayers murmured, a few tears shed. My grandmother had been beloved in the community, and the turnout reflected that. I kept a low profile, listening but feeling detached. Near the end, something caught my eye: a man standing near the back, partially obscured by a column. His stance was rigid, his face unreadable. After the service, I helped clear up, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When I glanced toward the entrance, the man had disappeared. I asked my father if he had noticed anyone unusual, but he just shook his head, suggesting I was overthinking things. That evening, sleep eluded me. My childhood home, where I was staying for the week, felt oddly foreign. Sitting by the window, I absently scanned the street below, and then I saw him. The same man, standing across the road, facing the house. The dim street lamp barely illuminated his form, but I recognized his posture immediately. I turned for my phone, but by the time I looked back, he was gone. The next day, I returned to the church to discuss some details with Father Elias. He led me to a back room filled with dusty cabinets and hymnals. As I sorted through some old belongings of my grandmother's, I came across a small leather-bound book with her name written on the first page. Curious, I flipped through it. The pages contained handwritten notes, prayers, and names, some of them crossed out. At the very end, a sentence stood out in shaky script: "Be wary of the one who lingers." I asked Father Elias about it, but he remained composed. He said my grandmother often wrote reflections, and that the book was likely nothing more than that. Then he suggested I keep it, saying it might provide some comfort. His tone was even, yet something about it unsettled me. Still, I took the book with me. That night, sitting on my bed, I flipped through the pages again. I kept glancing at the window, feeling uneasy. Then the motion sensor outside flickered on. I moved closer, heart pounding. No one was there, but something about the air felt heavy. The book lay open in my lap, the words staring up at me. Be wary of the one who lingers. Determined to understand, I returned to the church the next morning, arriving early. The doors were unlocked, the air thick with incense. I made my way to the back room, but the belongings I had gone through the day before were gone. The book I had taken, now missing from my bag. As I turned to leave, movement caught my eye near the altar. My breath stilled. The man was there, standing silently, watching. This time, I didn't hesitate. I stepped forward, unwilling to let fear dictate my actions. I demanded to know who he was. He didn't react, but slowly raised a hand, pointing toward the confessionals. Then, as soundlessly as before, he turned and disappeared down the hall. I hesitated only a moment before approaching the confessionals. The wooden booths were dark, doors slightly ajar. I swallowed my nerves and pushed one open. Inside, another book sat waiting, identical to my grandmother's, but filled with different names. Flipping through, my stomach tightened. The names listed belonged to congregation members, including my grandmother. Some had small symbols beside them. Then I saw another name, Father Elias. A rustling sound made me turn. Father Elias stood at the entrance, expression unreadable. He told me I had found something I wasn't meant to. My pulse pounded as I demanded answers. He smiled, calm, unnerving. He said some confessions were never meant to be recorded, and some sins could never be erased. Then he reached for the book and I bolted. I ran from the church, gripping the book tightly. I didn't stop until I was inside my car, locking the doors and speeding away. I never looked back. Weeks later, I tried researching St. Augustine's history, but found nothing unusual. The congregation continued as always. Father Elias remained, delivering sermons as if nothing had happened. The first time I entered St. Benedict's Church, I was 12 years old. My parents had recently moved to a small town in the Midwest, and Sunday service was a non-negotiable family tradition. The church itself was an imposing brick structure, its stained-glass windows casting colored shadows across the pews. The congregation was small but devout, and Father Martin, a soft-spoken man in his 50s, seemed to command a quiet authority over everyone who attended. By the time I turned 16, I had stopped paying much attention to the sermons. The church was just another place I had to be, something to endure before I could return to my normal life. That was when I noticed the man who always sat in the last pew. He never spoke to anyone. He never looked up during the service. He would arrive moments before it began and leave the moment it ended. No one seemed to acknowledge him. One Sunday, I asked my mother if she knew who he was. She told me not to worry about it, that some people just preferred to keep to themselves. But something about his presence unsettled me. I began watching him more closely, noting the way his hands always remained folded in his lap, the way he never responded when the congregation was called to stand. A few weeks later, I made up my mind to arrive early and sit in the last pew, just to see what he would do. But when I got there, the pew was empty. Service began and he never came. For the first time in years, I paid full attention to every moment, waiting for the sight of him. But he was nowhere to be found. The next morning, on my way to school, I saw him standing near the edge of town, facing the church. He didn't move as I passed, and when I turned to look back at him, he was still there, staring in the same direction. I told myself it was nothing, but a gnawing feeling in my stomach told me otherwise. That evening, I brought up the man again to my father. He set down his newspaper and sighed before saying that not everything needed to be questioned. Some people had their reasons for being the way they were, and it wasn't my place to interfere. But I couldn't let it go. The next Sunday, I decided to follow him when he left the church. He walked with a slow, deliberate pace, cutting through a side street I had never paid attention to before. I stayed a fair distance behind, expecting him to turn toward one of the houses. But he didn't. He walked past them all, down an alleyway, and into an abandoned building near the outskirts of town. I hesitated. Something told me to turn back. But curiosity overrode my fear, and I crept closer, stopping just outside the door he had entered. The building smelled of damp wood and dust, and the air inside was colder than it should have been. I peered around a corner and saw him kneeling in front of a wooden crate, his hands pressed together as if in prayer. I didn't mean to make a noise, but my foot slipped against the loose floorboards, and his head snapped up. For the first time, I saw his eyes, dark, hollow, like someone who had seen too much. He stared at me for what felt like forever, then spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. He told me to leave, that I had seen enough. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in the safety of my home, breathless and shaking. I told myself I wouldn't go back, that I would forget the entire thing. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the way he looked at me, the warning in his voice. The next morning, I returned to the abandoned building, but it was empty. No sign that anyone had been there. The wooden crate he had been kneeling before was gone. The space felt completely untouched. I never saw the man again. He never returned to the church, never appeared in town. When I finally asked Father Martin about him, the priest simply smiled and said that faith brought people to the church in many different ways. Some found what they needed and others did not. I never thought much about church security. It seemed like a job that required little more than locking doors and keeping an eye out for lost kids. When I got the position as a night security guard for St. Matthew's Church, I figured it would be easy work, some peace and quiet, a steady paycheck, and a place that felt safer than most late-night gigs. I was wrong. The job was simple. My shift started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. I'd do rounds every hour, checking doors, walking the perimeter, and making sure nothing was out of place. It wasn't a big church, one main hall, a few offices, a kitchen, and a basement used for storage. There was an old security system with grainy cameras covering the entrances, and a radio I used to check in with the local security dispatch every few hours. The first few nights were uneventful. The church had a quiet presence, the kind that made the world outside seem distant. I liked walking through the empty pews, hearing my own footsteps echo against the high ceilings. The air always carried the faint scent of wax and old wood, something oddly comforting. Then, on the fourth night, I noticed the first oddity. During my midnight round, I found one of the side doors slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it earlier. No signs of forced entry, no footsteps leading in or out. I secured it again, telling myself I must have been careless. The next night, it happened again. This time, I made a mental note of how I locked the door, double-checked it before my rounds, and yet, at midnight, it stood open just a crack. My gut told me something was wrong. I checked the security footage from the past hour, but the camera facing that entrance had been flickering with static. By the sixth night, the unease settled into my routine. I carried my flashlight a little tighter, listened a little harder to the silence around me. I started keeping a log, noting every minor disturbance. On the eighth night, I heard it. Faint footsteps coming from the nave, the main hall of the church. I was near the back office, and for a moment I thought I had imagined it. But then another soft step, the shuffle of fabric against a wooden pew. I turned off my flashlight and listened. It was subtle, slow movement, as if someone was trying not to be heard. My first instinct was that someone had slipped inside before I locked up, maybe a homeless person looking for shelter. I took cautious steps toward the hall, my hand resting on my radio. When I rounded the corner, the pews were empty. I walked the entire hall, my pulse steady, but high. Nothing. The doors were locked, the windows shut. The silence was deep, pressing against my ears. I convinced myself it had been an echo of my own steps, my imagination playing tricks. But the next night, it happened again. This time, the sound was clearer, more deliberate. Footsteps pacing near the altar. I hurried towards the front, moving faster this time, my flashlight cutting through the dark. As I reached the altar, I caught movement from the corner of my eye, a shadow, slipping behind one of the massive columns. I called out, stating that the building was closed, that if someone needed shelter, I could call for assistance. No answer. I stepped closer, heart pounding now. When I turned the corner behind the column, there was no one there. I started leaving the lights on in the main hall after that. The church felt different at night now, no longer a place of peace, but of something unseen, something watching. My routine stayed the same, but I moved differently, more cautious, more aware. A few nights later, I checked the security footage hoping to catch something, anything. Most of it was normal, but around 2 a.m., when I had heard the last round of footsteps, the cameras showed something strange. The main hall was empty, yet the pews shifted slightly, as if weight had pressed down on them. I reported my findings to the church administrator. He was an older man, calm and composed, and listened patiently. He told me I wasn't the first security guard to mention strange occurrences at night. There had been others, and all of them eventually requested reassignment. He didn't elaborate, only said that if it became too much, I should let him know. That night, I decided to stay in the main hall during my rounds, sitting in the back pew where I could see the entire space. Hours passed and nothing happened. I almost convinced myself I had let the stories get to me. Then at 3:12 a.m. I saw it. The heavy doors at the front of the church, the ones I had locked at the start of my shift, pushed inward an inch. Not enough for someone to enter, just enough to break the stillness. My breath caught in my throat. I stood, my radio in one hand, my flashlight in the other. I waited, unmoving. The doors didn't move again. The silence stretched. Finally, I forced myself to approach. I placed my palm against the wood and pushed lightly. They didn't budge. locked, just as they should be. That was my final night at St. Matthew's. I handed in my resignation the next morning, citing personal reasons. The administrator nodded, as if he expected it. He didn't ask for an explanation, didn't try to persuade me to stay.